Hatshepsut was born into the royal family during Egypt's 18th dynasty, when Egypt had recently expelled the Hyksos foreign rulers who had controlled northern Egypt for over a century and was entering period of expansion and prosperity. Her father was Thutmose I, a strong military pharaoh who campaigned in Nubia and Syria, who restored Egyptian power and prestige, who ruled from Thebes where the great temple of Karnak was growing ever larger through Pharaoh's additions. Her mother was Ahmose, the great royal wife, the primary queen whose children would have strongest claim to succession. Hatshepsut was not eldest child, not even only daughter, but she was daughter of the great royal wife, which gave her special status, made her royal in ways that children of minor wives were not. The education of royal daughters is mostly unknown. Ancient Egypt left few records of what princesses learned, how they were prepared for lives as queens or wives of high officials. But we can infer from Hatshepsut's later actions that her education was thorough, that she learned theology and administration, that she was present at court ceremonies and religious rituals, that she absorbed the ideology of divine kingship and the practical realities of governance. Perhaps Thutmose I, lacking surviving sons by his chief wife, involved his daughter more than was typical, allowed her to observe governance, taught her what Pharaoh must know and do. The speculation is supported by Hatshepsut's later claims. When she became pharaoh, she proclaimed that Thutmose I had designated her as his successor, had presented her to the court as future ruler, had intended her to reign. Whether this was true or was later propaganda is debatable. No contemporary records survive to confirm or deny the claim. But the claim itself is revealing. Hatshepsut understood that legitimacy required connection to her father, required presenting herself as chosen heir rather than as usurper, required theological and genealogical justification for breaking tradition that said only men could be pharaoh. The theology of Egyptian kingship was complex and deeply gendered. The pharaoh was not simply king in political sense, was divine, was living Horus, was son of Ra, embodied male creative power that sustained cosmic order. The queen was important but was not divine in same way, was mother of future pharaoh, was priestess in certain cults, was symbol of femininity that complemented Pharaoh's masculinity. For woman to be pharaoh was not simply matter of woman holding political power, was theological problem, was challenge to cosmic order, required reimagining what divine kingship meant and how woman could embody what was supposed to be essentially masculine role. But there were precedents, though rare and ambiguous. Queens had ruled as regents when pharaohs were children or when succession was unclear. Some queens had exercised real power behind scenes, had influenced policy and patronized building projects. A few women in earlier dynasties may have ruled briefly in their own right, though records are fragmentary and contested. Hatshepsut could look to these precedents, could argue that women had ruled before, that theology allowed for female kingship in extraordinary circumstances, that what she was doing was unusual but not unprecedented, was dramatic but not impossible. The childhood memories we imagine walking through Karnak with her father, watching as he performed rituals, observing as officials prostrated themselves, learning the gestures and words that made Pharaoh divine, absorbing the confidence that came from being royal, from being daughter of living God, from being born into power that ordinary humans could not imagine. These shaped her. Not because she was plotting even then to become Pharaoh, but because she learned that power was normal, that divine status was birthright, that ruling was what her family did, what her bloodline existed to do. The lesson would matter later when circumstances put her in position to claim throne. She would not feel she was doing something inappropriate or transgressive, would feel she was doing what her birth had prepared her for, what her education had equipped her for, what her father might have intended for her. Whether her father actually intended it is unknowable. But that Hatshepsut believed it or claimed to believe it shaped everything that followed. The daughter who learned kingship by watching her father rule, who absorbed the confidence of royalty, who understood divine kingship not as abstract theology but as lived reality, this daughter would later claim that kingship for herself, would insist that gender was less important than blood and divine selection, would reimagine what Pharaoh could be. The chapter closes with Thutmose I's death and Hatshepsut's transition from princess to queen. The transition was traditional. She married her half-brother Thutmose I, who became Pharaoh, who was son of Thutmose I by minor wife and whose claim to throne was strengthened by marriage to Hatshepsut, daughter of great royal wife. The marriage between half-siblings was not unusual in Egyptian royal family, was deliberate strategy to keep power within family, to ensure that royal blood was concentrated, to strengthen legitimacy through multiple connections to previous pharaohs. But the marriage set up the situation that would eventually lead to Hatshepsut's unprecedented reign. Thutmose I was not strong pharaoh. Ancient sources suggest health problems, short reign, limited accomplishments. Hatshepsut as queen beside him was already powerful, already visible in inscriptions and reliefs, already exercising influence. When Thutmose I died after perhaps 14 years of reign, leaving only young son by minor wife, the future Thutmose I Hatshepsut became regent. Was natural choice, was senior royal, was experienced in governance, was stepmother to young pharaoh, was person with authority and capability to rule until child came of age. The regency was supposed to be temporary. Hatshepsut was supposed to govern until Thutmose I was old enough to rule alone, then step back into traditional queen's role. But something happened during those years of regency. Whether it was ambition or recognition that she was effective ruler, or belief that she was better suited to rule than her stepson, or response to threats to her position as child pharaoh matured, or theological conviction that she was chosen by God's, Hatshepsut made decision that would define her legacy. She declared herself pharaoh, not queen regent, not queen mother, not consort, but pharaoh, with all the titles and regalia and divine status that term implied. The daughter who learned kingship was about to teach Egypt that kingship could wear a woman's face. The princess who watched her father rule was about to rule in ways that would shock tradition. The queen who was supposed to be temporary regent was about to become pharaoh whose reign would last 2 decades, and whose memory would be so dangerous that someone would try to erase it completely. The journey from royal daughter to female pharaoh begins. The transformation that theology said was impossible is about to occur. The woman who would wear the false beard and claim divinity is stepping into history's light, soon to be followed by attempt to push her back into darkness. The transition from regent to pharaoh was gradual, was careful, was supported by elaborate theological justifications that Hatshepsut had inscribed on temple walls, that proclaimed her divine right to rule, that reimagined Egyptian theology to accommodate female kingship. The inscriptions survive, allow us to see how she built legitimacy, how she addressed the problem of gender, how she created narrative that made her pharaoh acceptable, or at least made opposition to her pharaoh difficult to articulate within Egyptian religious and political framework. The first justification was divine birth. Hatshepsut commissioned reliefs showing her conception and birth as divine events, the god Amun-Ra taking the form of Thutmose I and impregnating Queen Ahmose, the divine pregnancy announced by gods, the birth attended by divine midwives and protective deities. The birth scene deliberately paralleled scenes from earlier pharaohs' birth narratives, established that Hatshepsut was not simply human daughter of human king but was divine child, was daughter of Amun himself, was pharaoh by divine will from conception. The claim was not unique. Other pharaohs made similar claims of divine parentage, but for woman to make it was remarkable, was assertion that divinity transcended gender, that if gods could father pharaohs through human women, then goddess-like qualities could also manifest in female ruler. The second justification was her father's designation. The inscriptions claim that Thutmose I presented young Hatshepsut to court, proclaimed her as his successor, had her crowned as co-regent during his lifetime. The claims are unprovable. No contemporary records from Thutmose I's reign survive that mention such designation. But unprovability worked in Hatshepsut's favor. Who could contradict her claims about her deceased father's intentions? The designation narrative served to present her rule as continuation rather than usurpation, as fulfillment of her father's will rather than as violation of tradition. She was not seizing power inappropriately but was assuming role that had always been intended for her, was honoring her father's wishes, was acting in accordance with divine and paternal authority rather than against them. The third justification was oracle. Hatshepsut claimed that Amun himself, through oracle at Karnak, had proclaimed her pharaoh, had commanded the gods and humans to accept her rule, had made divine will explicit and undeniable. The oracle was convenient, was claim that could not be disproven, was appeal to authority higher than human judgment, was way of making opposition to her rule not simply political disagreement but religious sacrilege. If Amun had proclaimed Hatshepsut pharaoh, then to oppose her was to oppose God, was to violate Ma'at, was to risk divine punishment and cosmic disorder. The theological justifications were supported by practical realities. Hatshepsut was already governing, had been regent for years, had made decisions, had commanded officials, had overseen building projects and conducted rituals. The transition to pharaoh was less dramatic change in what she did than in how she presented it, less about acquiring new powers than about claiming new titles and symbols. The practical competence mattered. Officials who had worked with her as regent, priests who had performed rituals with her participation, military commanders who had accepted her authority, all these had reasons to accept her as pharaoh because accepting her simply formalized what was already reality. But the gender problem remained. Pharaoh was male role, was embodiment of masculine divine power, was father to Egypt in theological sense. For woman to be pharaoh required either reimagining gender or transcending it, required either making woman masculine or making gender irrelevant to divinity. Hatshepsut chose both strategies simultaneously, created deliberate ambiguity in how she presented herself. The visual representations are fascinating and contradictory. Early in her reign as pharaoh, Hatshepsut appeared in reliefs wearing traditional female clothing, tight dress, no false beard, recognizably feminine body, but with pharaonic regalia and titles. The images proclaimed, "I am woman and I am pharaoh," both simultaneously without contradiction. But later images shifted. Hatshepsut appeared increasingly masculine in representation, wearing the false beard that symbolized pharaonic authority, dressed in male royal regalia, shown with bare masculine torso in some reliefs. The later statues are particularly striking, show figure that is neither clearly male nor clearly female, or rather is both, has feminine face but masculine body, wears beard but has delicate features, combines male and female elements into something ambiguous, something that transcends gender categories through embodying both. The names and titles also show careful negotiation of gender. A Hatshepsut used feminine grammatical forms in some contexts, masculine forms in others, sometimes switching within same inscription. The flexibility suggests deliberate strategy. In contexts where Pharaoh was supposed to be father to Egypt, she used masculine forms. In contexts where personal identity mattered, she used feminine forms. The pronoun shifts were not confusion or error, were careful manipulation of language to allow her to be both woman and pharaoh, to inhabit both gender categories as circumstances required. The false beard is particularly symbolic. The pharaonic false beard was not attempt to look like actual man, was ceremonial object, was symbol of divine kingship, was marker of office rather than of biological sex. By wearing it, Hatshepsut claimed she was performing pharaonic role, was embodying divine authority, was not pretending to be man but was taking on symbols that transcended individual identity. The modern parallel might be judicial robes or academic regalia clothing that marks role and office regardless of wearer's personal identity. A Hatshepsut wearing false beard was claiming that pharaonic office was not inherently gendered, that woman could perform role and embody its symbols while remaining woman. The strategy was sophisticated but created ambiguities that later made her vulnerable. If gender was transcended, if woman could be pharaoh, then what did that mean for theology that defined pharaoh as male? If Hatshepsut was legitimate pharaoh, did that mean future women could claim throne? If gender was irrelevant to divine kingship, what other supposedly fixed categories might be flexible? The questions threatened order not because Hatshepsut herself was threat, but because the implications of accepting her rule undermined certainties that Egyptian ideology depended upon. We close with image of Hatshepsut at Karnak, performing rituals that only Pharaoh could perform, wearing the double crown that symbolized rule over Upper and Lower Egypt, carrying the crook and flail that marked Shepherd King's authority, speaking words that transformed her into living God. The image is powerful and disturbing powerful because woman is claiming ultimate authority in deeply patriarchal society, disturbing because claim threatens cosmic order that society believed depended on proper gender roles. The regent became divine. The woman became pharaoh. The gender categories that were supposed to be fixed proved flexible. The cosmic order survived, though later someone would decide it had been violated and would try to restore it by erasing Hatshepsut from history. The most celebrated achievement of Hatshepsut's reign was the expedition to Punt, mysterious land that Egyptians had traded with for centuries, but that they saw as exotic, as distant, as realm of marvels and precious goods that enhanced pharaonic prestige. Hatshepsut commissioned this expedition early in her reign as pharaoh, sent 5 ships down the Red Sea to Punt, brought back goods that were displayed at Thebes and that were commemorated in extensive reliefs carved on her mortuary temple walls at Deir el-Bahri. The reliefs survive, provide detailed account of expedition, show us how Hatshepsut used this achievement to enhance her legitimacy, to demonstrate that she could fulfill pharaonic duties, to prove that gods favored her reign by granting success in dangerous venture. The location of Punt is debated was probably somewhere on Red Sea coast, perhaps in modern Eritrea or Somalia, perhaps extending inland into what is now Ethiopia. The Egyptians never precisely described Punt's location, referred to it vaguely as God's land, as place of sunrise, as realm at edge of known world. The vagueness was perhaps deliberate, maintaining Punt's exotic mystique enhanced the prestige of trading there, made pharaohs who successfully conducted expeditions seem more powerful, made the goods brought back seem more precious. The reliefs show the expedition's preparation, the ships being loaded, the journey down the Red Sea, the arrival in Punt, the meetings with Punt's rulers, the goods being traded and loaded onto ships, the return voyage, the presentation of goods to Amun at Karnak. The detail is extraordinary. We see myrrh trees being carefully dug up with root balls intact for transplanting to Egypt. We see exotic animals including giraffes and cattle. We see ivory and ebony and gold and cosmetics. We see incense and aromatic resins that were essential for temple rituals. The most famous scene shows the ruler of Punt and his wife greeting the Egyptian delegation. The wife is depicted with unusual body proportions, appears to have severe steatopygia, medical condition causing extreme fat accumulation in buttocks and thighs. Modern scholars debate whether this was accurate portrayal of individual or whether it was Egyptian way of depicting foreignness, of showing that Punt's people looked different from Egyptians. The unusual depiction might also have been way of marking Punt as exotic realm where even bodies were different, where the normal rules didn't apply, where marvels and strangeness were to be expected. But why did Hatshepsut commission this expedition? The practical reasons are obvious. Egypt needed myrrh and frankincense for temple rituals, wanted exotic goods that displayed pharaonic wealth, benefited from trade that brought luxury items and resources. But the expedition also served propaganda purposes. Previous pharaohs had conducted expeditions to Punt. The most recent successful one had been centuries earlier, during the Middle Kingdom. By successfully mounting expedition to Punt, Hatshepsut demonstrated continuity with past pharaohs, showed that she could accomplish what great kings had accomplished, proved that her reign was blessed by gods who allowed dangerous voyage to succeed. The emphasis on divine favor is explicit in the reliefs. The expedition is presented as commissioned by Amun himself, as response to divine command, as fulfillment of God's will. Hatshepsut is shown receiving Amun's instructions, is depicted as obedient daughter carrying out Father God's wishes. The framing makes the expedition's success proof of Hatshepsut's legitimacy. If gods had opposed her rule, they could have prevented expedition's success, could have destroyed ships or prevented trade or withheld the precious goods. But gods granted success, therefore gods approved her reign, therefore opposition to her was opposition to divine will. The goods brought back were displayed prominently and dedicated to Amun at Karnak. The myrrh trees were planted in rows before Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahri, creating fragrant garden that proclaimed exotic trade and divine favor. The incense was used in temple rituals, ensuring that every time priests performed ceremonies, they were reminded of Hatshepsut's achievement. The exotic animals were likely kept at Thebes as curiosities, as proof of Pharaoh's reach extending to edges of known world. Every aspect of the expedition's results was deployed to enhance Hatshepsut's prestige and legitimacy. But the expedition also reveals something about how Hatshepsut understood her role. She did not personally lead the expedition. Female pharaoh leading ships down Red Sea would have been too radical, would have violated too many conventions about women's roles and spaces. Instead, she sent trusted official, commissioned the voyage in her name, received credit for its success while maintaining appropriate gendered boundaries. The strategy shows Hatshepsut's pragmatism. She claimed pharaonic authority but recognized that some male activities were too gendered to appropriate directly, that she could rule as pharaoh while still acknowledging that certain aspects of male role were not available to her. The reliefs at Deir el-Bahri showing the Punt expedition occupy prominent position on the temple's walls. Visitors approaching the temple would see these scenes, would understand Hatshepsut's achievements, would recognize that gods favored her reign. The placement was not accidental, was part of broader program at Deir el-Bahri that presented Hatshepsut's reign as divinely ordained, as successful, as worthy of eternal commemoration. The temple itself was Hatshepsut's most ambitious building project, was architectural masterpiece that harmonized with dramatic cliffs behind it, that created space of extraordinary beauty and spiritual power. The expedition to Punt was practical achievement and propaganda triumph, was successful trade mission and theological statement, was demonstration of pharaonic capability and claim of divine favor. The dual nature characterized much of Hatshepsut's reign. Everything she did served multiple purposes, advanced both practical and ideological goals, strengthened both her current position and her future legacy. The sophistication reveals intelligence and political skill, reveals ruler who understood that power requires both effective governance and effective propaganda, that legitimacy must be both claimed and demonstrated, that ruling successfully requires both doing Pharaoh's work and being seen to do it in ways that reinforce right to rule. We close with image of myrrh trees planted before Hatshepsut's temple, fragrant garden that proclaimed exotic trade and divine blessing, living testimony to expedition's success that would survive for years, perhaps decades, as constant reminder of what she had accomplished. The trees eventually died, the reliefs record them, but the trees themselves are long gone, but the reliefs remain, carved into stone, preserving memory of expedition even when physical evidence disappeared. The Land of Punt faded back into mystery. Subsequent expeditions were rare. The location was lost. Even the name Punt eventually disappeared from later records, but Hatshepsut's expedition was immortalized in stone, became permanent testament to reign that someone later tried to erase but could not fully destroy. Djeser, Holy of Holies, rises at Deir el-Bahri in three great terraces against the cliff face, harmonizes with natural landscape so completely that it seems to grow from the rock rather than being imposed upon it. This was Hatshepsut's mortuary temple, her eternal house, the architectural masterpiece that would ensure her memory even when her name was chiseled from walls. The temple's architect was Senenmut, high official whose relationship with Hatshepsut has inspired speculation for millennia. Was he lover? Was he simply loyal official? The question is probably unanswerable, but what's clear is that Senenmut understood Hatshepsut's vision, translated it into architecture that still takes breath away 35 centuries later. The temple's design was revolutionary. Previous mortuary temples were relatively modest structures near pyramid tombs. A Hatshepsut built on unprecedented scale created structure that proclaimed pharaonic power and artistic achievement, that would be visible for miles, that would dominate the west bank of Thebes. The location was carefully chosen. The natural amphitheater of cliffs provided dramatic backdrop. The site had sacred associations with earlier monuments. The rising terraces would allow processions to climb toward sky, toward the realm of gods. The approach to the temple was through long causeway flanked by sphinxes showing Hatshepsut with lion bodies and human faces, some with false beards symbolizing pharaonic authority. The sphinxes announced temple's purpose was house of pharaoh, was space where divine and human met, was place where Hatshepsut's memory would be eternally sustained through rituals and offerings. The causeway led to first terrace, open courtyard with colonnaded porticos on three sides, reliefs showing scenes from Hatshepsut's reign, the expedition to Punt, the transport of obelisks from Aswan to Karnak, various religious festivals and ceremonies. The second terrace was reached by ramp ascending from first level, created sense of rising toward sacred, toward approaching divine realm. This level contained the birth colonnade, the reliefs showing Hatshepsut's divine conception and birth that established her right to rule, and the Punt colonnade showing the famous expedition. The colonnades were architectural innovation, created shaded walkways where reliefs could be viewed, provided elegant transitions between open spaces and enclosed chambers, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how architecture shapes experience. The third terrace was most sacred, contained the sanctuary of Amun-Ra, the chambers where Hatshepsut's cult would be maintained, the spaces where daily rituals would eternally sustain her ka, her spiritual essence. The cliff behind the temple contained chambers cut deep into rock, including Hatshepsut's tomb, though she would later be buried in Valley of the Kings rather than behind her mortuary temple, maintaining tradition that pharaohs' tombs should be hidden rather than marked by obvious structures. The temple's beauty derived partly from its proportions, from the way the three terraces created ascending rhythm, from how the colonnades repeated geometric patterns while varying details, from the harmony between architecture and natural setting. The cliff face behind the temple seemed to be part of the architecture, seemed to provide the fourth wall that enclosed the sacred space, seemed to connect earth and sky through vertical stone that architecture echoed in horizontal terraces. The effect was transcendent. The temple seemed to lift visitors toward heaven, to create path from human realm to divine realm, to manifest in stone the ascension that Hatshepsut's soul would make after death. But the temple also served immediate political purposes. Every element proclaimed Hatshepsut's legitimacy and achievements. The birth reliefs showed divine parentage. The Punt reliefs showed successful expedition blessed by gods. The Karnak obelisk scenes showed her piety and generosity to Amun. The whole structure demonstrated that she could build on scale that great pharaohs built, that she commanded resources and labor necessary for such projects, that her reign was prosperous enough to support monumental architecture. The temple was propaganda, was theology made stone, was claim to legitimacy that could not be easily dismissed because it was so beautiful, so impressive, so obviously blessed by gods who would not have allowed such achievement if they opposed her rule. Senenmut's role extended beyond architectural design. He supervised the construction, managed the enormous project that required quarrying stone, transporting it to site, carving it, placing it precisely. The logistics were staggering: thousands of workers over years of construction, continuous supply of materials and food and tools, coordination of multiple specialized crafts from quarrying to carving to painting. That Senenmut managed this successfully testifies to administrative capability, to organizational genius, to ability to translate vision into reality through effective management of resources and people. Senenmut also left his mark, literally hidden images of himself in temple spaces where they wouldn't be noticed except by those who looked carefully, secret assertions of presence in Hatshepsut's eternal house. The hidden images have inspired speculation about their relationship. Were they lovers? Did Hatshepsut allow him unprecedented access and honor because of personal relationship? Or was he simply brilliant official who earned trust and was rewarded appropriately? The images prove nothing definitive but suggest intimacy of some kind, suggest that Senenmut felt entitled to mark his presence in Pharaoh's temple in ways that would normally be inappropriate for official, however powerful. The temple was designed to function eternally. Daily rituals would be performed, offerings would be presented, priests would maintain Hatshepsut's cult, ensuring her continued existence in afterlife. The rituals required endowments, lands assigned to temple, agricultural production dedicated to supporting priests and providing offerings, workers assigned to maintain building and perform ceremonies. Hatshepsut provided lavish endowments, ensured her temple would be supported in perpetuity, created system that would sustain her memory and her ka forever. But forever proved shorter than Hatshepsut hoped. Later, during the reign of Thutmose III or perhaps his successor, Hatshepsut's name and images were systematically defaced throughout the temple. The cartouches were chiseled away, the faces on statues were destroyed, the reliefs showing her were modified to show Thutmose III instead. The erasure was careful and deliberate, was not vandalism but was systematic attempt to remove Hatshepsut from history, to transfer credit for the temple and its achievements to Thutmose III, to pretend that Hatshepsut had never ruled as pharaoh. But the erasure could not undo the architecture. The temple stood too beautiful to destroy, too impressive to demolish, too sacred to eradicate. Those who erased Hatshepsut's name could modify inscriptions but could not change the building's essential character, could not prevent future visitors from marveling at its beauty, could not make it unexist. The temple survived erasure, survived centuries of neglect when Egyptian civilization fell and temple was abandoned, survived earthquakes and weathering and treasure hunters and modern tourism. The temple remains, testifies to Hatshepsut's vision and Senenmut's genius, stands as her most enduring monument even though her name was removed from its walls. We close standing on third terrace as sunset paints the cliffs gold, as shadows lengthen across courtyards, as the temple shows why erasure failed, because architecture speaks even when inscriptions are silent, because beauty transcends names, because what Hatshepsut built could not be destroyed even when her memory was attacked. The temple that touches heaven, the Holy of Holies, the architectural masterpiece that preserved her legacy even when everything else was taken away. Djeser stands, Hatshepsut's name is restored, the temple speaks. At Karnak, the great temple complex where pharaohs for centuries added their monuments to honor Amun-Ra, Hatshepsut raised two obelisks of unprecedented height, nearly 100 feet of solid red granite, each weighing approximately 320 tons, quarried at Aswan and transported over 500 miles down the Nile to Thebes. then erected in the temple's heart where they would catch the first rays of sunrise and the last light of evening. One still stands, tallest ancient obelisk still in its original position, testament to engineering achievement and to theological statement Hatshepsut was making. The obelisks were not simply monuments, were prayers in stone, were connections between earth and heaven, were physical manifestations of the sun god's rays striking earth, were Hatshepsut's gift to Amun and her claim to divine favor made permanent and unmissable. The inscriptions on the obelisks survive, allow us to read Hatshepsut's own words explaining why she raised them, what they meant to her, how she understood her relationship with the god. The texts are remarkable, are personal in ways that formal pharaonic inscriptions rarely were, reveal pride and piety and determination, show Hatshepsut defending her achievements and anticipating criticism. She writes, "I have done this with a loving heart for my father Amun. My heart prompts me to make for him 2 obelisks of electrum whose points shall reach heaven." The language is intimate. She calls Amun her father, speaks of her loving heart, describes the obelisks as reaching toward heaven as if yearning to touch divine realm. But the inscriptions also defend against anticipated criticism. Hatshepsut writes, "He who shall hear this will not say, 'It is a boast, what I have said.' Rather say, 'How like her it is, she is devoted to her father.' The God knows it of me, the Lord of the gods, the Lord of all. He made me rule this land. I have not forgotten his commands." The defensiveness is telling, suggests that Hatshepsut expected people to question her motives, to suggest that her monumental building was vanity rather than piety, to criticize female pharaoh for spending resources on monuments rather than accepting more modest role. The defense continues. "I swear as I am loved of Ra, as my father Amun favors me, that I speak in very truth without exaggeration. I did not sleep because of his temple. I did not forget anything of what he had ordained. My heart was before my father. I entered into the plans of his heart." The oath-taking, the insistence on truthfulness, the claim of sleepless devotion all suggest anxiety about credibility, concern that female pharaoh would not be believed, determination to establish that her achievements were genuine and divinely inspired rather than propaganda or exaggeration. The engineering achievement of raising the obelisks was extraordinary. The granite was quarried at Aswan, where outcrops of red granite provided material for obelisks and statues. The quarrying process involved cutting trenches around the obelisk's outline, driving wooden wedges into cracks and wetting them to make them expand and split the stone, gradually freeing the obelisk from bedrock. The process took months, required hundreds of workers, risked catastrophic failure if stone cracked incorrectly or if hidden flaws caused fracture. One of Hatshepsut's obelisks was intended to be matched by a third, but that obelisk cracked during quarrying and remains at Aswan still, the unfinished obelisk, testimony to the risks involved in such projects. Once quarried, the obelisk had to be transported. The exact method is debated, but likely involved building reinforced barge capable of carrying the immense weight, floating the barge to quarry during Nile's high water season when river was deepest and strongest, sliding the obelisk onto the barge using mud and wooden rollers, then towing it downstream to Thebes. The journey took weeks, required constant attention to prevent barge from sinking or running aground, was engineering challenge comparable to quarrying. Reliefs at Deir el-Bahri show the transportation show massive barge carrying the obelisks, towed by numerous boats, celebrated as triumph of engineering and divine favor. Erecting the obelisk at Karnak required different engineering. The obelisk had to be raised from horizontal to vertical position, had to be positioned precisely on its base, had to be secured so it wouldn't topple. The method likely involved building earthen ramp, sliding the obelisk up the ramp on rollers, positioning it over its base, then carefully lowering it as earth was removed from beneath. Alternative theories suggest using levers and counterweights or combinations of methods. Whatever the technique, the result was success. The obelisk stood, aligned to catch sunlight, towering over Karnak's courts, impossible to miss or ignore. The theological meaning was multi-layered. The obelisks represented sun gods' rays, were physical manifestations of light striking earth, were connection points between divine and human realms. By raising obelisks to Amun-Ra, Hatshepsut was honoring the god, was creating permanent conduits for divine power, was marking Karnak as sacred space where heaven and earth met. The height mattered. The taller the obelisk, the closer it reached toward heaven, the more impressive the achievement, the stronger the connection to divine realm. Hatshepsut's obelisks were tallest ever erected at Karnak, were statement that her devotion exceeded predecessors, that her reign was blessed with unprecedented divine favor. But the obelisks also served political purposes. Every sunrise that illuminated them, every visitor to Karnak who saw them, every priest who performed rituals in their shadow, all were reminded of Hatshepsut's piety and power, of her capability to accomplish what other pharaohs had accomplished, of her right to rule demonstrated through monumental achievement. The inscriptions naming her as Pharaoh, describing her relationship with Amun, proclaiming her achievements, these were carved into granite that would last millennia, that could not be easily erased or modified, that would testify to her reign long after she was gone. The later fate of the obelisks reveals the complexity of the erasure campaign. One obelisk still stands intact, its inscriptions readable, Hatshepsut's name visible. The other fell in antiquity, broke into pieces, now lies in ruins around Karnak. But neither was destroyed deliberately during the erasure campaign. They were too sacred, too impressive, too connected to Amun to be demolished. Instead, Thutmose III built walls around them, obscuring them from view, hiding Hatshepsut's name without destroying her monuments. The strategy was revealing, showed that even those who erased her memory recognized that some achievements were too significant to eradicate, that obelisks dedicated to Amun could not be destroyed without sacrilege, that Hatshepsut's connection to the god was real enough that attacking her monuments might anger the deity they honored. The walls eventually came down, were dismantled in later periods when Hatshepsut's erasure was forgotten, and obelisks were again valued as architectural achievements regardless of who raised them. The obelisks emerged from behind walls, stood again in sunlight, continued serving their purpose of connecting earth and heaven, of catching divine light, of testifying to pharaonic power and piety. The attempt to hide them failed as completely as attempt to erase Hatshepsut's name failed. Both survived, both endured, both continue speaking across millennia. We close at sunset, watching as last light strikes the surviving obelisk's pyramidion, the pyramid-shaped cap covered in electrum gold-silver alloy that Hatshepsut described, that caught light and blazed like captured sunlight, that symbolized the Benben, the primordial mound where creation began, that made the obelisk into cosmic symbol as well as architectural achievement. The light fades, the obelisk darkens, but it stands still, 100 feet of granite reaching toward heaven, Hatshepsut's prayer in stone, testament to female pharaoh who built on scale of Egypt's greatest kings, who raised monuments that could be hidden but not destroyed, whose name could be erased from inscriptions but could not be erased from the architecture that proclaimed her achievements. The obelisks that pierced the sky. The connection between earth and heaven that Hatshepsut created. The monuments that survived erasure, the prayer in stone that still stands. Hatshepsut's reign was not solo achievement, was supported by a circle of powerful officials who administered Egypt, who managed building projects, who conducted trade and diplomacy, who made the governmental machinery function during 2 decades of female pharaohs' rule. These officials left their own monuments, built their own tombs, created inscriptions that testify to their service and to their relationship with Hatshepsut. Through their monuments we see how Hatshepsut governed, who she trusted, how she built coalition that supported her unprecedented reign, how she rewarded loyalty and competence regardless of the gender complications that might have made other pharaohs reluctant to elevate subordinates too high. Senenmut stands out among the officials, was steward of Amun, overseer of Hatshepsut's building projects, tutor to her daughter Neferir, holder of more than 80 titles that made him one of most powerful men in Egypt. His tomb at Deir el-Bahri was unprecedented for non-royal person, was architectural achievement in its own right, contained astronomical ceiling showing stars and constellations in detail that suggests sophisticated astronomical knowledge, included numerous statues showing him with Princess Neferir, proclaimed his importance and his intimacy with royal family in ways that would normally be inappropriate for official, however elevated. The relationship between Hatshepsut and Senenmut has inspired speculation and romance for centuries. Were they lovers? The evidence is ambiguous. There are no explicit statements of romantic relationship, but the level of trust, the honors granted, the access to royal family, the hidden images of himself in Hatshepsut's temple all suggest intimacy beyond normal official pharaoh relationship. Though the speculation is probably unanswerable definitively, but what's clear is that Senenmut was essential to Hatshepsut's success, that he managed her most important projects, that she relied on him in ways that suggest deep trust, that their fates were intertwined. Senenmut's disappearance is mysterious. He vanished from the record during the later part of Hatshepsut's reign. No death notice, no burial in his elaborate tomb, no explanation for his absence from monuments and inscriptions that had prominently featured him for years. The disappearance has inspired multiple theories. Did he die and receive burial elsewhere? Did he fall from favor? Was he executed for overreaching? Did he retire? The mystery deepens because his tomb was never finished. His monuments were defaced even before the broader erasure of Hatshepsut began, suggesting that something happened to him specifically rather than his memory being attacked simply because of association with her. Other officials provide different perspectives on serving female pharaoh. Hatshepsut was high priest of Amun-held position that controlled enormous wealth and religious authority, oversaw temple administration and ritual practice. His support was crucial. Religious establishments' acceptance of Hatshepsut as legitimate pharaoh made opposition difficult, made theological arguments for her rule more persuasive, ensured that daily temple rituals acknowledged her as divine ruler rather than questioning her legitimacy. Hatshepsut's monuments proclaim his loyalty to Hatshepsut, show him receiving honors and offices from her, testify that highest religious authority in Egypt accepted female pharaoh without apparent reservation. Nasi was treasurer, oversaw financial administration, managed expeditions including the famous voyage to Punt. His titles and monuments show that Hatshepsut trusted him with critical responsibilities, that she rewarded competence with promotion and honors, that gender did not prevent her from working effectively with male officials or from delegating authority to them. The pattern suggests that Hatshepsut's government functioned smoothly, that she had administrative skills necessary to choose capable subordinates and manage them effectively, that whatever complications her gender created in theological realm did not prevent practical governance from proceeding normally. Ahmose Penekbet was military official, served from childhood under multiple pharaohs including Hatshepsut, recorded in his tomb autobiography that he was rewarded by her, that he participated in military actions during her reign, that he viewed service under female pharaoh as normal part of career rather than as anomaly requiring explanation or justification. The matter-of-fact tone is revealing, suggests that among those actually governing, Hatshepsut's gender was less problematic than later erasure would suggest, that she functioned as pharaoh in ways that subordinates could accept and work with, that pragmatic concerns of administration and warfare proceeded regardless of theological complications about female kingship. The officials' monuments show consistent patterns. They proclaimed loyalty to Hatshepsut, received honors and titles from her, served in positions that required trust and competence, viewed their service as legitimate and worthy of commemoration in tombs and inscriptions that would preserve their memory eternally. The consistency suggests that Hatshepsut built effective government, that she had political skills necessary to maintain support among powerful officials, that she rewarded loyalty appropriately, that she governed in ways that made officials willing to stake their own reputations and legacies on association with her. But the monuments also show later complications. Many officials who served Hatshepsut continued serving under Thutmose III after her death or disappearance, found ways to present their careers as continuous service to legitimate pharaohs, without explicitly addressing the problem of having served female ruler whose memory was later attacked. The continuities suggest that Hatshepsut's death or removal was not violent purge, that officials who served her were not punished simply for that service, that transition to Thutmose III's sole rule was smooth enough that careers continued across the change. The later erasure of Hatshepsut affected monuments but apparently did not affect the officials who served her. They were not punished retrospectively, suggesting that erasure was about theological correction rather than about political revenge. The question of why officials supported Hatshepsut is complex. Practical reasons are obvious: she was powerful, she rewarded service, she governed effectively. Opposing her would have been career-ending and possibly life-threatening. But there may also have been genuine acceptance, genuine belief that she was legitimate pharaoh, genuine willingness to serve female ruler because she demonstrated capability, and because theological justifications for her rule were persuasive enough. The mixture of pragmatism and principle probably varied among officials. Some served primarily because they had to, others served because they believed in her right to rule. Most probably had mixture of both motivations. The legacy of these officials is their testimony to Hatshepsut's governance. Through their monuments we see that she ruled effectively, that she commanded loyalty and service, that she managed complex administration and built magnificent monuments and conducted successful foreign expeditions, that her reign was not chaos or failure but was period of prosperity and achievement. The testimony matters because it comes from those who actually participated in governance, who knew whether Pharaoh was effective or incompetent, who had no reason to exaggerate her achievements if she were failing. Their monuments proclaim success, proclaim prosperity, proclaim that serving Hatshepsut was worthy service to legitimate ruler, until later someone decided it wasn't and began erasing her from history. We close contemplating how government actually functioned during Hatshepsut's reign, not in theoretical terms about whether woman could be pharaoh, but in practical terms of decisions made, projects managed, officials appointed, resources allocated, trade conducted, temples built. In these practical terms, Hatshepsut succeeded. The officials who served her testify to that success through monuments that mostly survived the erasure, through careers that continued after her reign ended, through willingness to be associated with her that suggests service was honorable rather than shameful. The officials who served the female king, the men who made her reign function, the administrators whose competence enabled her achievements. The testimony that survives in tombs and inscriptions, proclaiming that Hatshepsut governed effectively regardless of theological problems her gender created. Neferir was Hatshepsut's daughter by Thutmose II, was royal princess who should have been great royal wife to her half-brother Thutmose III. should have been queen mother to next pharaoh, should have followed pattern that made royal women powerful but not pharaohs themselves. Instead, Neferir disappeared from historical record, vanished during Hatshepsut's reign, left no tomb, no monuments of her own, no evidence of marriage or motherhood or the role she should have played. The absence is mysterious, raises questions about what happened to her, about whether her fate was connected to Hatshepsut's unprecedented position, about whether daughter of female pharaoh could find appropriate role when mother had already broken all the patterns that defined how royal women should live. The evidence for Neferir's existence is substantial in her childhood. Numerous statues show Senenmut holding young princess, show him with titles relating to her upbringing and education, proclaim his role as tutor and steward responsible for her care and training. The statues are unusual, showing non-royal male with royal child in such intimate poses, suggesting that Senenmut's relationship with Hatshepsut extended to trusted position with her daughter, that he was essential to royal family in ways that went beyond normal official duties. The statues also show that Neferir was important enough to merit such monuments, that her position as Hatshepsut's daughter gave her status worth commemorating. But as Neferir matured, the evidence becomes ambiguous. She appears in some scenes as adult woman, holds title of God's wife of Amun, important religious position that gave royal women significant power and income, but there's no evidence of marriage to Thutmose III, no evidence of children, no evidence of the queenship that should have been her destiny. The absence suggests something prevented the expected pattern. Perhaps she died young. Perhaps Hatshepsut's position as pharaoh made normal queenship impossible or unnecessary. Perhaps theological complications about female pharaoh extended to uncertainty about how daughter of such pharaoh should be positioned. One possibility is that Hatshepsut groomed Neferir as heir, intended daughter to succeed her as pharaoh, wanted to establish that female rule could continue beyond single generation. If so, the plan failed. Neferir never became pharaoh, disappeared from records before Hatshepsut's reign ended, left no evidence of having been prepared for rule or having attempted to claim it. But the possibility exists because Hatshepsut's own rule had broken precedent so completely. If mother could be pharaoh, why not daughter? If theology allowed for female kingship once, why not perpetually? The questions may have been considered, may have been rejected as too radical even for Hatshepsut, or may have become moot when Neferir died or withdrew from public life. Another possibility is that Neferir's position became impossible because of Hatshepsut's pharaonic status. The normal role for royal princess was to become great royal wife to new pharaoh, to legitimize his rule through her royal blood, to produce heirs who would have claims to throne through both parents. But if Hatshepsut was pharaoh and Thutmose III was junior co-ruler or was being sidelined, what was Neferir's role? She couldn't be great royal wife to her mother. Marriage to Thutmose III would legitimize him in ways that might undermine Hatshepsut. Perhaps the solution was to make her God's wife of Amun, to give her religious role that provided status and power without creating succession complications. The disappearance suggests death, possibly in childbirth if she did marry and bear children whose records didn't survive, possibly from disease or accident that took her before her time. Ancient Egypt was a dangerous place even for royal women. Infection, complications from childbirth, diseases that modern medicine easily treats but that ancient medicine could not cure. All these killed people regardless of status. If Neferir died young, it would explain the absence of later monuments, explain why expected patterns didn't materialize, explain the silence that surrounds her fate. But the disappearance also raises darker possibilities. Did Hatshepsut's position endanger her daughter? Did theological complications about female rule extend to wanting to prevent another generation of women claiming pharaonic authority? Did Thutmose III or his supporters eliminate Neferir to prevent her from competing for power? The speculation is unsupported by evidence. There's nothing suggesting violence or assassination, nothing indicating that Neferir was a threat that had to be removed. But the questions arise because the disappearance is so complete, so unexplained, so mysterious that it invites speculation about causes beyond simple death from natural causes. What's clear is that Neferir did not fulfill expected role, did not become the queen and queen mother that royal princess should have become, did not perpetuate the pattern that made royal women powerful in specific ways while reserving pharaonic power for men. Whether this was because of Hatshepsut's choices, or because of Neferir's death, or because of complications created by unprecedented situation of female pharaoh having adult daughter, the result was disruption of patterns, was failure of expected succession, was absence where there should have been presence. The relationship between Hatshepsut and Neferir is mostly unknown. We can imagine bond between mother and daughter, can speculate about how Hatshepsut's choices affected her child, can wonder whether Neferir supported her mother's pharaonic claim or resented it, whether she was proud or ashamed, whether she wanted to follow her mother's example or wanted to return to traditional female roles. But we cannot know. Neferir left no writings, no autobiography, no monuments explaining her perspective. We see her only through others' eyes, through Senenmut's statues showing him as her tutor, through brief mentions in inscriptions, through the absence that defines her later life. The tragedy, if it was tragedy, is that daughter of the only female pharaoh in Egypt's long history did not survive to tell her story, did not leave monuments proclaiming her achievements, did not establish pattern that other royal daughters might follow, did not create alternative path for women in royal family beyond the traditional roles. Whether this was personal tragedy for Neferir or was simply demographic accident of early death, or was result of Hatshepsut's choices that left no room for daughter to find appropriate role, we cannot determine. But the absence speaks. The daughter who should have ruled, who should have been queen, who should have had monuments and achievements recorded for eternity, this daughter vanished, leaving barely a trace, leaving questions that cannot be answered, leaving silence where there should have been voice. We close with image of Senenmut's statue holding young Neferir, the only substantial testimony to her existence, the monument showing her as child before the complications of adulthood, before the disappearance, before whatever happened that left her without the future she should have had. The statue survives in museums now, testimony to child who once was, to royal daughter who should have mattered more than she did, to potential that was never realized, to questions that will never be answered. The daughter who should have ruled, the princess who disappeared, the silence where her story should have been, forever mysterious, forever lost, forever reminding us that even in royal families, even among the powerful and privileged, fate could intervene, could disrupt expected patterns, could take away futures that seemed certain. Thutmose III was child when his father died, was perhaps 2 years old when Hatshepsut became regent, was young boy growing into adolescence and manhood during the years when his stepmother claimed pharaonic titles and ruled Egypt in her own right. The traditional narrative presents him as victim, as rightful pharaoh denied his throne by ambitious stepmother, as king-in-waiting forced to endure decades of subordination, as ruler who eventually took revenge by erasing Hatshepsut's memory after her death. But the evidence is more complex, suggests that relationship between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III was not simply antagonistic, that he may have ruled as junior co-regent during much of her reign, that transition after her death or disappearance was peaceful rather than violent, that erasure came years after her death rather than immediately, suggesting motives more complicated than simple revenge. The co-regency is visible in inscriptions and reliefs where both Hatshepsut and Thutmose III appear, where both are shown performing pharaonic rituals, where both hold royal titles. The arrangement was unusual but not unprecedented. Egypt had experienced co-regencies before, though typically between father and son rather than between stepmother and stepson. The co-regency allowed Hatshepsut to rule while acknowledging Thutmose III's claim to throne, created compromise that avoided direct confrontation over legitimacy, established pattern where both could be pharaoh simultaneously with Hatshepsut dominant but Thutmose III not entirely excluded. The evidence for Thutmose III's activities during the co-regency is limited but suggestive. He dated his reign from his father's death rather than from Hatshepsut's death or removal, implying that he considered himself pharaoh from the beginning even if he was junior partner. He appears to have led military campaigns. The evidence is fragmentary, but some inscriptions suggest that he was commanding armies during later part of Hatshepsut's reign, was gaining military experience and authority even while she remained senior ruler. The military role made sense, would have given energetic young man appropriate outlet for ambition, would have built his reputation and prepared him for full pharaonic authority, would have been role that was clearly masculine and therefore not in direct competition with Hatshepsut's claims to pharaonic office. The relationship between them is unknowable in personal terms. Did Thutmose III resent Hatshepsut? Did she genuinely care for her stepson or view him as rival to be managed? Were there affection and mutual respect, or was there barely concealed hostility? The formal inscriptions tell us nothing about emotions, only about public claims and official positions. We can imagine scenarios: resentful stepson forced to wait while stepmother usurped his throne, or carefully managed arrangement where both benefited from cooperation, or evolving relationship that changed as young boy matured into adult man capable of ruling independently. All are possible, none are provable. What happened at the end of Hatshepsut's reign is uncertain. Did she die naturally? Did she withdraw from public life? Was she forced from power? Did she continue ruling until her death, or did she step aside at some point and allow Thutmose III to become sole ruler? The inscriptions go silent. Hatshepsut's monuments stop being updated. Her name stops appearing in new contexts. The records shift to showing only Thutmose III. The silence could mean death, could mean removal, could mean voluntary retirement. We do not know, and likely will never know unless new archaeological evidence emerges. What's clear is that transition was not violent upheaval. Thutmose III's reign began or continued smoothly. There's no evidence of civil war or purge. The officials who served Hatshepsut continued serving Thutmose III. The government functioned without apparent disruption. The smooth transition suggests negotiated settlement rather than forcible seizure of power, suggests that Hatshepsut's rule ended in a way that allowed continuity rather than requiring revolutionary break. Whether the settlement was arranged before her death, whether she agreed to step aside, whether she died conveniently when political pressures were mounting, these are speculations built on silence. The erasure of Hatshepsut's memory came years after the transition, began perhaps 2 decades into Thutmose III's sole rule, was systematic campaign to remove her name from monuments, to transfer credit for her achievements to Thutmose III, to rewrite history as if she had been regent but never pharaoh, or better yet, as if she had been minor figure not worth remembering. The delay between her disappearance and the erasure's beginning is puzzling. If Thutmose III hated her and wanted revenge, why wait so long? If the issue was theological correction, why wasn't it immediate priority? The most likely explanation is that erasure was not about personal animosity but about dynastic legitimacy. Thutmose III's son and designated heir was Amenhotep II, who would succeed his father and continue the dynasty. But Amenhotep II's claim to throne ran through Thutmose III, whose claim ran through Thutmose II, whose claim ran through Thutmose I. If Hatshepsut had legitimately been pharaoh, if her reign was acknowledged, then the succession was complicated. Did it run through her or around her? Did her reign interrupt the male succession, or was it part of continuous line? The theological problems multiplied, the legitimacy became unclear, the neat patrilineal succession was disrupted by having to explain how woman had been pharaoh and what that meant for future claims. The solution was erasure to remove Hatshepsut from official record, to present succession as running directly from Thutmose II to Thutmose III without acknowledging the intervening female reign, to restore theological clarity by pretending the problematic period had never occurred. The erasure was not vandalism or revenge but was attempt at historical revision, was effort to clean up records, to make succession comprehensible within traditional framework, to prevent future complications by establishing that Hatshepsut's precedent was not really precedent because it had been erased and therefore hadn't officially happened. But Thutmose III was also pragmatist. He couldn't destroy Hatshepsut's monuments without sacrilege. The temples were dedicated to gods. The obelisks honored Amun. Destroying them would anger deities. He couldn't erase her completely without acknowledging how much she had accomplished: the trade expeditions, the building projects, the successful governance. So the erasure was selective, removed her name and image where possible, transferred credit to himself where necessary, but preserved the monuments themselves, walled up the obelisks, left the temples standing. The selectivity reveals that even those erasing her recognized that her achievements were real, that what she had built could not simply be undone, that complete erasure was impossible. Thutmose III's own reign was extraordinarily successful. He campaigned extensively in Syria and Palestine, established Egyptian empire at its greatest extent, brought vast wealth back to Thebes, built monuments throughout Egypt and Nubia, reigned for more than 3 decades as sole ruler, and was remembered as one of Egypt's greatest military pharaohs. His success made Hatshepsut's erasure easier. Who would remember relatively peaceful reign of building projects when they could celebrate military conquests and imperial glory? Who would defend memory of female pharaoh when male pharaohs' achievements were so obviously impressive and so traditionally pharaonic? Yet Thutmose III's success also raises questions. Did Hatshepsut's peaceful, prosperous reign create conditions that made his military expansion possible? Did the administrative efficiency she established, the wealth she accumulated, the diplomacy she conducted, did these provide foundation for his conquests? The relationship between reigns is complex. Thutmose III likely benefited from Hatshepsut's achievements even as he worked to erase her memory, built upon foundations she laid even as he denied she had laid them, succeeded partly because of what she accomplished even as he claimed sole credit. We close with image of Thutmose III in old age, successful warrior pharaoh looking back on decades of reign, remembering perhaps the stepmother who had ruled before him, the woman whose memory he had ordered erased but whose monuments still stood, whose achievements could not be fully denied even when her name was removed. Did he feel guilt? Did he feel the erasure was necessary? Did he believe the theological justifications, or were they convenient excuses for political expediency? We cannot know his thoughts, can only observe his actions and speculate about motivations. The Koking who waited, the stepson who may have resented or may have respected, the pharaoh who erased yet could not fully destroy. The relationship between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III remains one of history's mysteries. Was it antagonistic or cooperative, personal or purely political, hostile or respectful? The silence preserves uncertainty. The monuments preserve only fragments. The truth, as always, eludes our grasp. The campaign to erase Hatshepsut from history was systematic, was thorough, was sustained over years, was successful enough that for 3,000 years almost no one knew she had existed. Her name was chiseled from monuments, her images were defaced or removed, her cartouches were replaced with those of Thutmose I or Thutmose II or Thutmose III. Her statues were torn down and smashed or buried in pits. Her role in events was transferred to male pharaohs in rewritten inscriptions. The erasure was careful work, not vandalism, but deliberate historical revision, attempting to correct the record, to remove the anomaly of female pharaoh from Egyptian chronology, to restore proper order by pretending the violation of that order had never occurred. But erasure is never complete. Stone is hard to destroy, monuments are too massive to eliminate entirely. Inscriptions can be defaced but shadows remain, buried statues can be recovered, architectural achievements cannot be denied even when the architect's name is removed. The persistence of evidence despite erasure campaign allows us to reconstruct what was hidden, to recover the erased pharaoh, to understand both what Hatshepsut achieved and what was done to her memory. This chapter examines how erasure worked, why it failed, what it reveals about ancient attempts at historical revision and modern archaeological recovery. The methods varied by medium and location. On stone monuments, Hatshepsut's cartouches, the oval shapes containing hieroglyphs spelling her name, were carefully chiseled out, leaving blank ovals or ovals filled with other names. The work was precise, was done by skilled stone carvers who knew how to remove inscriptions without damaging surrounding stone, who worked systematically through temple complexes, removing every instance of forbidden name. The faces on statues showing Hatshepsut were attacked, chiseled away, broken off, damaged enough that image was unrecognizable but statue might remain standing. The reliefs showing her performing pharaonic rituals were modified. Her figure was sometimes recarved to show Thutmose III instead. Sometimes her image was simply removed, leaving blank space where Pharaoh should have been. The selectivity is revealing. The monuments themselves were largely preserved. Deir el-Bahri was not demolished. The obelisks were walled up but not destroyed. The building projects continued functioning as temples and monuments even as inscriptions were modified. The preservation suggests that erasure was about removing memory of person rather than about destroying achievements, was about theological correction rather than about denying that the accomplishments had happened. The work could be claimed by other pharaohs. Thutmose III could take credit for expeditions and monuments without acknowledging that Hatshepsut had commissioned them, but the physical reality of impressive architecture could not be erased without massive effort and possible sacrilege. The statues were treated differently. Many were pulled down and smashed, suggesting anger or at least determination that images of female pharaoh should not be displayed. But the smashing was not thorough. Statues were broken but not pulverized, were damaged but not destroyed beyond recognition, were often buried in pits near Deir el-Bahri rather than being scattered or reused as building material. The burial suggests that even those destroying the statues recognized they were sacred objects that couldn't simply be discarded, that royal images required respectful treatment even when being hidden from view. The pits where statues were buried were discovered in early 20th century, yielded remarkable sculptures that allowed reconstruction of how Hatshepsut presented herself. showed the evolution from feminine representation to increasingly masculine and ambiguous imagery. The incompleteness of erasure stemmed partly from practical difficulties. Egypt was vast, monuments were numerous, inscriptions existed in multiple locations and contexts. Complete erasure would have required sustained effort over many years involving workers traveling throughout Egypt to modify every instance of Hatshepsut's name. The effort was attempted but was not completed. Some inscriptions in remote locations were never reached. Some secondary references were overlooked. Some contexts were considered too minor to bother modifying. The incomplete erasure meant that evidence survived, that later archaeologists could recover enough fragments to reconstruct the erased reign, that Hatshepsut's memory could be restored. The failure also stemmed from architecture's permanence. Deir el-Bahri stood as obviously major monument, was too beautiful and too sacred to destroy, proclaimed through its very existence that someone significant had built it even when inscriptions didn't say who. The obelisks at Karnak were too large and too holy to demolish, continued proclaiming achievement even when walled from view. The temples Hatshepsut built or enlarged continued functioning, continued serving purposes she had intended, continued testifying to effective reign even when her name was removed from dedication inscriptions. The physical presence of monuments undermined the textual erasure. Hard to claim someone never ruled when their building projects dominated the landscape. The rediscovery of Hatshepsut happened gradually during the 19th and early 20th centuries as archaeology became systematic, as hieroglyphs were deciphered, as scholars pieced together fragmentary evidence into coherent narrative. The breakthrough came when archaeologists realized that the mysterious gap in king lists, the period when no pharaoh seemed to rule, corresponded to evidence of major building projects and successful expeditions that someone had commissioned. The reconstruction required detective work comparing inscriptions, noting where names had been removed, recognizing patterns in defacement, connecting scattered references into comprehensive picture of female pharaoh's reign. The discovery of the statue pits at Deir el-Bahri was particularly important. The hundreds of statue fragments buried in pits near the temple revealed how Hatshepsut had represented herself, showed the evolution of her imagery, provided faces and bodies to attach to the increasingly clear historical record. The statues were reassembled, studied, displayed in museums worldwide, became iconic images of female pharaoh, the strange, ambiguous figures wearing false beards, combining masculine and feminine attributes, proclaiming through sculptural form the same complexity that inscriptions revealed through text. The modern reception of Hatshepsut has been complicated by gender politics. Early archaeologists sometimes presented her as usurper, as woman who inappropriately seized power, as villain of the story whose erasure was justified punishment for overreaching. Feminist scholars reclaimed her as hero, as woman who broke barriers, as successful ruler whose gender-based erasure was injustice that modern scholarship should correct. Both perspectives involve projection of modern concerns onto ancient situation, involve making Hatshepsut into symbol for contemporary debates about women's power and ambition. The more nuanced view recognizes that Hatshepsut was neither villain nor hero in simple sense, was powerful woman in position of extraordinary authority making pragmatic choices to maintain and legitimize her rule, was effective pharaoh whose reign was prosperous and successful by ancient Egyptian standards, was also person whose memory was attacked for reasons that were theological and political and only partially related to gender. The complexity resists simple modern appropriation. Hatshepsut cannot be reduced to feminist icon without ignoring the context of divine kingship and dynastic politics, cannot be dismissed as usurper without acknowledging her genuine achievements and effective governance. We close contemplating the persistence of memory despite attempts at erasure. Hatshepsut's name is known now, is spoken in museums and classrooms worldwide, is studied and debated and written about in ways that those who erased her could not have imagined. The monuments still stand, the inscriptions are being restored with her name returned to where it was chiseled out, the statues are displayed and admired, the achievements are acknowledged and attributed to her. The erasure failed completely, not immediately, not obviously, but across millennia the truth emerged, the hidden pharaoh was recovered, the forbidden memory was restored. The erasure that could not succeed, the memory that would not stay buried. The name that was silence for 3,000 years but that speaks now louder than ever, proclaiming that Hatshepsut was, that she ruled, that she achieved, that she mattered, and that attempts to deny these truths were doomed to fail because stone remembers even when memory fails, because architecture preserves when inscriptions are destroyed, because truth has weight that historical revision cannot permanently overcome. In 2007, Egyptian authorities announced that they had identified Hatshepsut's mummy, one of two female mummies found in tomb KV60 in the Valley of the Kings, lying beside empty sarcophagus that had been intended for Hatshepsut but had been found empty decades earlier. The identification was based on dental evidence, on CT scans, on genetic markers, on comparison with known royal mummies, on detective work involving missing tooth found in canopic jar and matching gap in mummy's jaw. The announcement was dramatic, was celebrated as solving mystery of what happened to female pharaoh's body, was presented as final chapter in Hatshepsut's story. But the identification is disputed. Some Egyptologists accept it, others remain skeptical. The evidence is circumstantial rather than definitive. The certainty claimed by those making identification is questioned by those reviewing methodology and findings. The dispute matters less than what it reveals, that even in death, even in identification of corporeal remains, Hatshepsut remains controversial and uncertain, remains subject to debates and disagreements, remains figure whose reality resists simple determination. The mummy that may be hers becomes meditation on mortality, on embodiment, on what remains when power is gone and flesh has decayed, on whether physical remains matter or whether legacy is all that survives. The mummy itself is unremarkable, is elderly woman, is obese, shows signs of diabetes and bone disease and dental problems, appears to have died in her 50s from infection or cancer or combination of ailments. If this is Hatshepsut, the contrast with her images is stark. The beautiful youthful representations in statuary, the idealized pharaonic images showing divine perfection, the masculine powerful presentations in later iconography, all these contrast with reality of diseased aging female body, with mortal flesh subject to decay and pain, with physical form that matches no representation carved during her lifetime. But perhaps the contrast is the point. Perhaps the gap between representation and reality, between pharaonic image and human body, reveals fundamental truth about divine kingship, that it was performance, was role that living human inhabited but that transcended individual body, was office that required presenting idealized version regardless of physical reality. Hatshepsut's images showed Pharaoh, showed divine ruler, showed eternal Ka that would continue after death. They did not show woman aging and suffering and dying from diseases that gods were supposed to prevent or cure. The disconnect between idealized representation and decayed reality is true of all pharaohs, but seems particularly poignant for female pharaoh who had to perform masculinity as well as divinity, who had to transcend gender as well as mortality, whose body becomes site where all these contradictions meet. The search for Hatshepsut's mummy began because her sarcophagus was found empty, because her intended tomb in Valley of the Kings contained no body, because unlike other pharaohs whose mummies were recovered from caches where priests had hidden them during periods of tomb robbery, Hatshepsut seemed to be missing entirely. The absence raised questions. Was her mummy destroyed during the erasure campaign? Was it hidden more successfully than other royal mummies? Did she never receive proper burial? The questions multiplied because female pharaoh who had been erased from textual record also seemed to be erased from physical record, seemed to have no corporeal remains that could testify to her existence. The tomb KV60 was minor tomb, was discovered early in 20th century but was not thoroughly investigated until decades later, was found to contain 2 female mummies lying unwrapped and unidentified, was considered relatively unimportant because mummies were not in sarcophagi and tomb lacked the grandeur of royal burials. One mummy was labeled as wet nurse of Hatshepsut based on inscription, was removed to museum. The other remained in tomb, was largely ignored, was not considered potentially significant until researchers reviewing evidence about Hatshepsut's missing mummy remembered this unidentified female in minor tomb. The identification process involved bringing mummy to Cairo Museum for CT scanning, comparing bone structure and facial features with Hatshepsut's statuary, examining DNA to see if genetic markers matched other royal mummies, and crucially, matching tooth found in canopic jar inscribed with Hatshepsut's name to gap in mummy's jaw. The tooth match was presented as definitive evidence the canopic jar was certainly Hatshepsut's. The tooth fit precisely into mummy's jaw, therefore the mummy must be Hatshepsut. The logic seems sound but depends on chain of assumptions that the canopic jar contents were not mixed up, that the tooth really came from that jar, that the fit is precise enough to rule out coincidence. The skeptics question each link in chain. The canopic jar was not found in secure archaeological context, had been moved, had been in museum collections, could have had contents contaminated or switched. The tooth fit might not be as precise as claimed. Dental forensics is not exact science. Gaps in jaws can accommodate multiple teeth. The DNA evidence is ambiguous. Genetic material degrades. Contamination is possible. Relationships among royal mummies are not definitively established because we don't know for certain which mummy is which pharaoh in all cases. The skepticism doesn't prove the identification is wrong but suggests that certainty is premature, that more evidence is needed, that declaring we have found Hatshepsut based on current evidence is overstatement. But whether this particular mummy is Hatshepsut or not, the questions it raises are profound. What does it mean to identify Pharaoh's remains? Is the physical body the person, or is the person the office they held, the monuments they built, the memory they left? If we found Hatshepsut's mummy definitively, would we know her better? Would the decayed flesh tell us anything that the stone monuments don't tell us more eloquently? The questions challenge modern fixation on physical remains, on DNA and bones and scientific certainty, suggest that ancient Egyptians might have been right that Ka and name and monuments were more important than corpse, that what matters is not the decaying meat but the enduring legacy. The mummy's condition, if it is Hatshepsut's, reveals that divine Pharaoh suffered mortal ailments, that power could not prevent aging and disease, that even rulers who claimed divinity were subject to physical decay. The disease is evident in CT scans: the diabetes, the bone disease, the dental problems, the likely cancer, all testify to mortality, to vulnerability, to the gap between divine pretensions and human reality. The contrast between healthy, youthful images carved on monuments and diseased, aging body lying in museum is reminder that representation is always idealization, that power requires maintaining appearance regardless of reality, that pharaohs were human even when they claimed to be gods. We close standing in museum looking at mummy that may or may not be Hatshepsut, contemplating what we're seeing if it's her. We're looking at woman who was pharaoh, who ruled Egypt, who built temples and raised obelisks, who claimed divinity and wore false beard, who was erased from history and recovered by archaeology. If it's not her, we're looking at anonymous woman from ancient Egypt, one of thousands whose names were not recorded, whose lives are unknown, who died and was mummified and buried and forgotten. Either way, we're looking at mortality, at flesh that was alive and is now preserved decay, at body that was person and is now object of scientific study, at remains that may answer questions or may simply raise more questions, that may provide closure or may preserve mystery. The mummy that may be hers. The body that might have housed the Ka of Pharaoh. The flesh that has outlasted the power, the bones that remain when monuments fall, the physical remnant of person whose memory was erased and recovered and debated and disputed. Whether this is Hatshepsut or not, the search for her reflects modern desire for material proof, for physical connection to past, for certainty that can be tested scientifically. But perhaps the search misses the point. Perhaps Hatshepsut is not in the mummy but in the monuments, not in the decaying flesh but in the enduring stone, not in the body that can be identified through DNA but in the legacy that transcends biological material, in the name that was erased and restored, in the story that continues being told 35 centuries after her death. A Hatshepsut's gender remains the lens through which most modern observers understand her story: the female pharaoh, the woman who ruled as man, the figure who challenges categories and transcends boundaries. But the modern fixation on gender may miss complexities of how ancient Egyptians understood sex, gender, embodiment, and divine kingship. This chapter explores what gender meant in ancient Egypt, how Hatshepsut navigated gender categories, what her example reveals about the flexibility and rigidity of gender systems, and why her story resists simple modern interpretations that see her as either breaking barriers or violating natural order. Egyptian theology recognized two fundamental principles: male and female, active and passive, creative and receptive, that were seen as complementary and necessary for cosmic order. The pharaoh embodied male principle, was active creative force, was Horus who impregnated Egypt, was son of Ra who maintained Ma'at through masculine authority. The queen embodied female principle, was receptive, was mother who received seed and bore children, was goddess who complemented Pharaoh's masculine power. The pairing was theological as well as biological, required both male and female elements functioning in harmony to maintain cosmic balance. But the theology also recognized that humans could contain both principles, that individuals might embody masculine and feminine aspects in various combinations, that gender was performance and role as much as biological fact. The gods themselves shifted gender in different contexts. Some deities were depicted as male in some myths and female in others. Some combined male and female attributes. Some transcended gender categories entirely. If gods could be fluid in gender, humans serving as divine rulers might also access both masculine and feminine power as circumstances required. Hatshepsut's solution to the theological problem of female pharaoh was to embody both genders simultaneously, to be woman and to perform masculinity, to retain feminine identity while claiming masculine authority, to wear false beard while using feminine grammatical forms, to present images that were ambiguous and shifting rather than fixed. The strategy was sophisticated, drew on Egyptian understanding that gender could be performed and multiple, allowed her to claim pharaonic power without denying her female identity, created space for female ruler within system that theoretically excluded women. The visual representations show the evolution of strategy. Early images show Hatshepsut in female dress with pharaonic regalia, is clearly woman wearing symbols of kingship, is both and female simultaneously without attempting to hide contradiction. Later images show increasingly masculine presentation, bare torso, male clothing, false beard, poses associated with male pharaohs. But even late images retain feminine elements. The face is delicate rather than stern. The body proportions are sometimes feminine despite masculine dress. The combination creates something that is neither simply male nor simply female, but is both or neither or something in between. The most fascinating images are those showing Hatshepsut and Thutmose III together, both as pharaohs, both wearing royal regalia. The images present two pharaohs without clearly marking which is male and which is female. Both wear false beards, both hold royal symbols, both appear in poses of authority and divinity. The gender ambiguity extends to both figures, makes it difficult to determine from imagery alone which ruler is which, suggests that pharaonic identity could transcend individual gender when multiple rulers were recognized simultaneously. The grammatical shifts in inscriptions are equally revealing. Egyptian language marked gender clearly in pronouns and verb forms. Hatshepsut's inscriptions sometimes use feminine forms. She has done this, Her Majesty, and sometimes use masculine forms. He has commanded, His Majesty, sometimes switching within single inscription. The switches were not errors but were deliberate choices about when to emphasize feminine identity and when to emphasize masculine pharaonic role. The flexibility suggests that Hatshepsut understood gender as contextual, as something that could be emphasized or minimized as circumstances required, as performance that could shift to suit different audiences and purposes. Modern scholars debate whether Hatshepsut identified as man, whether she experienced something like trans-identity in modern terms, whether her masculine presentations were genuine expression of gender identity or were pragmatic political strategy. The debate likely imposes modern categories on ancient situation that operated according to different logic. Hatshepsut probably did not think in terms of identifying as man or woman, but thought in terms of embodying pharaonic role, of performing what Pharaoh was supposed to do and be, of claiming authority through adopting symbols that conveyed authority regardless of personal gender identity. The important point is that the strategy worked Hatshepsut ruled effectively for 2 decades, was accepted by officials and priests and military commanders, performed pharaonic duties and fulfilled royal obligations, demonstrated that female ruler could function as pharaoh when she had legal authority and theological justification and political support. The success proves that gender categories were not absolutely fixed in ancient Egypt, that exceptional circumstances could create flexibility, that theological framework could be reinterpreted to accommodate female kingship when powerful women had motivation to claim throne and resources to support claim. But the later erasure proves that the accommodation was controversial, that many Egyptians were uncomfortable with female pharaoh, that theological justifications Hatshepsut offered were not universally persuasive, that her reign was seen by some as violation of proper order that needed to be corrected. The erasure was specifically gendered, targeted the female pharaoh while preserving achievements that could be credited to male rulers, attacked the person while preserving the projects, suggested that problem was not what Hatshepsut did but what she was, or more precisely, the incompatibility between what she was female and what she claimed to be pharaoh. The complexity resists simple modern appropriations. A Hatshepsut cannot be claimed straightforwardly as feminist icon because her power came from royal birth rather than from challenging patriarchy, because she ruled within divine kingship system that was profoundly hierarchical, because her gender strategy involved adopting masculine symbols rather than rejecting gender categories. But she also cannot be dismissed as mere usurper because she ruled effectively, because she had legitimate claim through regency and royal blood, because she created theological justifications that drew on Egyptian traditions and were accepted by many contemporaries. And perhaps the lesson is that gender is always more complicated than simple categories acknowledge, that human societies create rules about gender and then create exceptions when powerful individuals need exceptions, that systems that seem rigid prove flexible when circumstances demand flexibility, that claims about what women can or cannot do are always contingent on context and power rather than being natural or inevitable. A Hatshepsut demonstrates that woman could be pharaoh not easily, not without controversy, not without creating theological complications and later backlash, but could be pharaoh nonetheless when circumstances aligned, and when individual had capability and determination to claim the role. We close contemplating the ambiguous images, the shifting pronouns, the combination of masculine regalia and feminine identity, the theological creativity that made space for female pharaoh within system designed for male rulers. The gender that could not be fixed, that shifted and evolved, that was performed and claimed and embodied in ways that transcend simple male-female binary. A Hatshepsut as neither man nor woman, or as both simultaneously, or as something that ancient Egyptian categories could acknowledge even if modern categories struggle to name. The female pharaoh who wore the false beard, the woman who became king, the ruler whose gender was complexity rather than category, was question rather than answer, was challenge to assumptions about what was possible and what was forbidden. We stand at Deir el-Bahri as dawn breaks, as first light touches the temple terraces, as sun rises over the Theban hills just as it rose when Hatshepsut ruled, when her name was spoken in daily rituals, when her ka was sustained through offerings and prayers. The light touches the same stone that Hatshepsut's builders placed, illuminates reliefs that show her achievements even when her name was chiseled away, warms columns that have stood for 35 centuries that survived erasure and neglect and time's erosion. The temple stands, the dawn comes. And Hatshepsut's name is spoken again not by priests performing ancient rituals, but by archaeologists and tourists and scholars, not in ancient Egyptian but in dozens of modern languages, not as living pharaoh but as historical figure whose story has been recovered and whose achievements are acknowledged. The recovery is not complete, much remains unknown, many questions cannot be answered. The historical record has too many gaps and silences to permit comprehensive biography. We do not know what Hatshepsut thought or felt, do not know her personal motivations or private doubts, do not know how she understood her own unprecedented position or whether she anticipated the erasure that would follow her death. We see her only through public inscriptions and monumental architecture, through propaganda and theological justifications, through images carefully crafted to present specific version of pharaonic authority. The person behind the propaganda remains elusive, remains mysterious, remains unknowable across the millennia that separate us. But what we do know is significant. We know she ruled Egypt for approximately 22 years, from roughly 1479 to 1458 BCE. We know her reign was peaceful and prosperous, marked by building projects and trade expeditions rather than by military campaigns and conquests. We know she commissioned the expedition to Punt that brought back myrrh and incense, built Djeser that still amazes visitors, raised obelisks at Karnak that touched the sky, governed through capable officials who served her effectively and continued serving her successor. We know she claimed divine authority through elaborate theological justifications, presented herself as chosen by Amun, depicted her birth as divine event that legitimized her rule. We know she was erased from history, that someone, probably Thutmose III late in his reign, possibly his successor Amenhotep II, ordered systematic removal of her name from monuments, defacement of her images, burial of her statues, transfer of credit for her achievements to male pharaohs. We know the erasure was not complete, that evidence survived in fragments and shadows, that modern archaeology recovered what ancient authorities tried to hide. We know her monuments could not be destroyed, that Deir el-Bahri was too beautiful and too sacred to demolish, that the obelisks were too massive and too holy to topple, that architecture preserved memory when inscriptions were altered. We know she matters not just as historical curiosity, not just as exceptional woman in male-dominated society, but as example of how power actually works, of how individuals navigate systems that theoretically exclude them, of how theological frameworks prove flexible when powerful people need them to be flexible, of how attempts at historical revision ultimately fail when physical evidence survives to contradict official narratives. Hatshepsut's story teaches about gender and power, about legitimacy and propaganda, about memory and erasure, about the relationship between individual agency and structural constraints. The modern debate about how to interpret Hatshepsut reflects our own concerns as much as it illuminates ancient Egypt. Is she feminist hero who broke barriers? Is she ambitious woman who violated proper order? Is she pragmatic politician who made best of circumstances? Is she divinely chosen ruler whose gender was irrelevant to legitimate authority? All these interpretations contain partial truths, all miss nuances and complexities, all risk projecting modern assumptions onto ancient situation that operated according to different logic. And perhaps the wisest approach is to acknowledge complexity, to resist simple narratives, to see Hatshepsut as human operating in specific historical context, making choices constrained by circumstances but not entirely determined by them, achieving much but paying costs, ruling successfully but creating problems that later authorities felt compelled to address through erasure. She was powerful but vulnerable, successful but controversial, effective but ultimately erased and yet recovered, restored, remembered, studied, debated, admired, questioned. The contradictions define her as much as any single achievement. The dawn that breaks over Deir el-Bahri is the same dawn that has broken for 35 centuries. That broke when Hatshepsut ruled, that broke during the erasure campaign, that broke when the temple was abandoned and nearly forgotten. That breaks now when tourists and scholars come to marvel at the architecture and to contemplate the woman who built it. The continuity is profound. The sun does not care about pharaohs or erasure or archaeological discoveries, rises and sets with mechanical regularity regardless of human dramas played out beneath it. But the dawn also carries meaning, is symbol of renewal, of light emerging from darkness, of memory recovering from forgetting, of truth persisting despite attempts to suppress it. Hatshepsut's name is spoken in the dawn light, is carved again into cartouches that were left blank, is restored to monuments where it was removed, is written in books and articles and museum labels and tourist guides. The restoration is not ancient ritual. Her ka is not sustained through offerings. Her divine status is not acknowledged through prayers. Her pharaonic authority is not recognized through obeisance. But the restoration matters nonetheless, establishes that she existed, that she ruled, that she achieved, that attempts to erase her failed, that stone remembers when memory fails, that architecture preserves when inscriptions are destroyed. The questions remain: why did she claim the throne? How did she justify breaking tradition? What did it feel like to be female pharaoh in deeply patriarchal society? How did Thutmose III really feel about her? Why did the erasure come so late? What exactly happened at the end of her reign? The questions will probably never be answered definitively, will remain subjects for scholarly debate and informed speculation, will continue generating new interpretations as new evidence emerges and as methodologies evolve. But the fundamental facts are established. Hatshepsut was, she ruled, she achieved, she was erased, she was recovered. The story arc is complete even if details remain uncertain, is narrative of power and its limits, of achievement and its costs, of memory and its persistence, of how individuals shape history and how history shapes memory of individuals. The female pharaoh who wore two crowns, the red crown of Lower Egypt and the white crown of Upper Egypt, the divine crown of Pharaoh and the mortal crown of woman who dared to claim it. We close as sun fully rises, as temple is bathed in morning light, as tourists begin arriving to walk where Hatshepsut walked, to see what she built, to marvel at architecture that has survived 35 centuries and at story that survived 3 millennia of erasure before being recovered. The dawn that remembers her name, the light that illuminates her achievements. The morning that brings visitors to temple she built and that bears witness to reign she led and to legacy she left despite all attempts to take it away. Hatshepsut, Motkare, truth is the soul of Ra, the female pharaoh, the erased ruler, the recovered memory, the name that was silence and is now speech. The woman who became king and the king who became legend and the legend that became history and the history that continues being written as new evidence emerges and as interpretations evolve. A forever complex, forever controversial, forever fascinating, forever teaching about power and gender, about memory and erasure, about what survives when everything else is taken away. The dawn breaks, the temple stands, the name is spoken. A Hatshepsut endures not as living pharaoh, not as divine ruler, not even as clear historical figure about whom everything is known, but as presence, as question, as challenge to assumptions, as reminder that women have always claimed power when circumstances allowed, that gender categories have always been more flexible than ideologies acknowledged, that memory persists despite erasure, that truth emerges even when buried, that dawn always comes no matter how deep the darkness. Sleep now. Rest in the knowledge that Hatshepsut rests too, whether in identified mummy or in unknown tomb, whether in afterlife she believed in or in nothingness, but that her Ka lives on, sustained not by ancient offerings but by modern memory, not by priests' rituals but by scholars' research, not by divine magic but by human interest in those who came before, who achieved against odds, who left monuments that outlasted their own memories, who carved their names in stone even when someone tried to erase them. The female pharaoh, the sphinx who wore 2 crowns, the name erased from stone but written in the architecture that still stands, forever remembered, forever teaching, forever testifying that power can be claimed, that categories can be transcended, that erasure can fail, that memory can be recovered, that dawn always breaks, that light always returns, that truth persists even when buried for millennia. Hatshepsut, the dawn remembers her name, and we remember too. Sleep now knowing that her story is told, that her achievements are acknowledged, that her memory is restored, that the erasure failed, that she endures. The temple stands in morning light, the name is spoken. The female pharaoh rules still not over Egypt, not over empire, but over imagination, over memory, over the space where history and legend meet, where the recovered past speaks to the uncertain present, where those long dead continue teaching the living. Good night, the dawn has broken. Hatshepsut's name is remembered, her story is told, sleep well.